Okay.
Okay, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Kate Quinn, and I'm Associate Professor in Caribbean History at UCL Institute of the Americas and co-convener of the Caribbean Seminar Series, along with my colleagues, Professor Gad Human, and Dr. Steve Cushion. And I'm really, really pleased tonight to be able to welcome Dr. Nicole Burrows, who is Assistant Professor in the History Department at Rutgers University. She's a historian of 20th century social justice movements, relational histories of racialization and colonialism, Black internationalism, and the politics of solidarity. And it's a very interesting example of solidarity that we're going to hear about in today's seminar, which is entitled Seeds of Solidarity, African-Indian Relations and the 1935 Labour Rebellions in British Guiana. So Nicole will speak for up to about half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time afterwards for your Q&A. So welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Kate Quinn and Gad Human and Steve Cushion for inviting me to present at this Caribbean seminar. It's so nice to see, there's a few of you that I know, so it's nice to see you, well, to see your names on here, and I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A. I'm gonna share my screen, and I'm gonna also put on my little timer because All right. So in this talk, I wanted to introduce you all to my book in progress, Seeds of Solidarity, and to give you a sense of the different chapters. And I figured I would give you a couple of examples from chapter 4 in particular, which you'll learn about in a minute. And then close with some words from a Guyanese activist. We're all thinking about in the contemporary moment, a lot happening right now, as usual, and not as usual actually, but I'm hoping to get to that and think about it. So my manuscript, Seeds of Solidarity, chronicles a 1930s labor struggle led by youth, women, and men of African and Indian descent in the colony of British Guiana in the midst of environmental, economic, and political crises. Upon hearing about my work, one scholar said that from what he knows about Guyana, this is completely counterintuitive. And so my work really challenges the historiography that positions Black and Indian relations as so fraught that the possibility of collective action is unimaginable. Yet it also recognizes that the cross-racial actions taking place in the colony at that time did not represent a leveling of difference or erasing of racial identities. In fact, I present the diasporic projects led by African and Indian communities during the 1930s as evidence of contemporaneous rising racial consciousness. Specifically, I examine how these sugar workers led a series of labor uprisings within a colonial and societal context that actively discouraged cross-racial and labor solidarity. As all of you know, during the 1930s, there were major labor uprisings across the entire Caribbean and really across the world, including in Suriname and St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Cuba, Trinidad, Haiti, Jamaica, Barbados, Belize, and I can go on and on. I think one of the challenges I've had is when I was writing some of the historiography, I wanted to do a pan-Caribbean vision of it, and it's actually really hard. There's a lot of work, and the questions are kind of different in some of the historiography. So these rebellions, I'll actually stay on this page. These rebellions were part of a global appeals for rights, anti-racist and socialist struggle, as well as widespread calls against fascism and imperialism. Embedded in Caribbean feminist epistemology, my work continues a tradition of proposing a framework for solidarity that gains power from recognizing, understanding, and incorporating into struggles the differences that are otherwise employed to divide groups. I'm thinking about scholars like Shalini Puri, Rhoda Reddick, Alyssa Trautz, and many others. Scholars have pointed out the histories of dispossession, enslavement, and indenture are often written about separately using colonial records produced in different parts of empire. And I try to engage these entangled histories in the colony of British Guyana from a grassroots perspective in order to understand the production of difference and to think about the plantation logics that undergirded these processes that continue to live on and transform in the 1930s. And in terms of works that are foundational, I'm thinking about Guyanese historians Walter Rodney and Clem Citron, who I had the pleasure of meeting last summer in the archive. But my key interventions are the Center Working People in the 1930s and development of modern politics in the Caribbean, and traditions of scholars like Nigel Boland, Colin Palmer, and Laura Putnam, to use Guyana as a case study to think about the framework from Earl Lewis of overlapping diasporas, and by examining seeds of solidarity to counter generations of hegemonic narratives that focus exclusively on racial discord. I'm interested in a relational history of African and Indo-Guyanese in a moment where people actively refuse the ways in which they were profoundly structured. I wanted to choose this exhibit here that you're looking at. I'm sure some of you have seen it already, but it was a life-size exhibit called The Procession to kind of represent this talk. It was done by British Guyanese artist Hugh Locke for the Tate London Commission. And he said that he was interested in, quote, the echoes of history, unquote, and he argues that his work makes links with the historical after effects of the sugar business. He wanted to portray a kind of messy beauty through these images that promote hope and energy, even if the figures are going through or have suffered very hard times. I wanted to also switch back to the that I'm writing. I realized looking at some of the names that many or most of you are very familiar with Guyana. But as you know, the riots that took place in the 1960s really shook the colony of British Guyana, and it was the result of colonial histories, British and American collusion, leadership competitions based on race and ideology, and political parties that became parties of racial self-defense. And witnesses to the right will often say that overnight, multiracial villages became single race because people would leave their homes in fear, running for their lives. And yet, as historian activist Walter Rodney said, this history of conflict has been mapped onto the future and also projected backwards into the past. And my father really told me a number of stories about that time when he was growing up. And he was a young man. He talked about being terrified, but he also always told me stories about protection, people protecting people of other communities, friendship, defiance in terms of some of the things that were going on. And those stories really impacted me in terms of how I think, right? And in 2020, you have the writings of Afro-Guyanese activist Andaye, which were published after her death in 2019 and edited by Alyssa Chatz. And she spent a lifetime of solidarity intervening in the racial divisions and ethnic insecurities that have plagued Guyana for generations. And she fought for the rights of women and girls through a politics of care. And she was deeply invested in countering women's unwage labor and fighting against structural adjustment and neoliberal policies. She was one of the two people who really helped to develop both the Working People's Alliance, founded in 1974, and the women's organization Red Thread, founded in 1986. And one of the articles in this book that I want to point to, because I also use it in a lot of ways, is this article called 1964, The Rupture of Neighborliness and Its Legacy for Indian-African Relations. It was collectively written by Andaye and Dr. Chatz, and they collected 44 interviews with women from Red Thread. I'm sorry, my voice, give me a second. And I've seen accounts that lay blame on one side or the other. But what's interesting about this particular article is that they really try to render these women's stories in really balanced ways, which is quite difficult. And they included voices about the violence, the rape, the fear, the betrayal, and the othering from those people who directly experienced it. And they discussed the betrayal of neighborliness, the loss of neighbor and neighborhood that, quote, altered life as people had known it, unquote. And so there's a before and there's an after, and it's on the before moment. They said for many, the dominant memory before was, quote, one of connection across race and ethnic divide, unquote. And so for me, it's about that before moment and really trying to think about what that looked like and voicing that in the street. So I wanted to give you a brief overview of the book, and here's some of the chapters. And to think about how these rebellions played a role within the larger context of the 1930s and the Caribbean. So the first chapter kind of discusses the larger historiography, where there is a dearth in terms of 1930s histories in the history of Guyana. And I wanted to talk about what this story has implications within the region and beyond. And here's some of the historiography. There's a vast historiography. We were talking about Richard Hart as well. I've been trying to figure out when he first published his work on the 1930s Caribbean, but here are some examples. So you have a sense of some of the things I'm thinking about as I'm writing and some of the people I'm engaging. I use a lot of different kinds of sources: British colonial records, correspondence, census records, autobiographical accounts, commissioned testimonies and reports, newspapers from Guyana, the wider Caribbean, India, the United States, and Britain, emissary reports from Indian organizational documents, missionary records. And in chapter 3 in particular, I also utilize imaginative literary texts as articulations of Caribbean ways of knowing, and really to talk about the limits of the flowing archive. Chapter 1 is the seeds of division, and it kinds of lays a foundation. And this is my work in progress. I don't think I said that in the beginning. So I really welcome feedback at this point. I'm in the process of revising, and so I would really welcome any questions or comments that could help me develop this if possible. But chapter 1, Seeds of Division, lays the foundation of the work by providing a brief overview of colonization, racialization, and coercive labor mechanisms in Guyana. The entangled histories of dispossession, enslavement, and indenture frame this chapter's exploration of how difference was produced, how the sugar industry came to dominate the political life of the colony, and how divide and rule actually worked. The chapter closes with a discussion of the 1928 decision to adopt Crown Colony government. And this happened all over the Caribbean, but it did come late in Guyana, British Guyana. And a small elite, fearing the expansion of a tiny but growing electorate of color, opted out of the then barely representative system of government and placed decision-making firmly in the hands of the Crown. Chapter 2, and these are images from the Jean Bahadur Singh collection, as well as from Ethiopia on the left. But this chapter is entitled Overlapping Diasporas in the Colony, and explores racialization through the process of identity development on the ground. So during that decade, we know that African Guyanese celebrated the centennial of their emancipation from enslavement, and Indian Guyanese celebrated the centennial of their arrival in the colony. And the African Guyanese continue to build connections across the Black world. Projects range from the development of a local Tuskegee, loosely modeled after African-American leader Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, dedicated to gender projects of economic uplift, to the Guyana branch of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, which also at the time organized support for Ethiopia against Italy's invasion in 1935. Indian Guyanese were also expressing their desire to retain Indian language, religion, and culture, requesting steamship services to India, Hindi schools, and fighting for inclusion during the post-indenture period, as well as making connections across the Indian diaspora. And as part of this chapter, I also wanted to think about how these communities overlapped, right? And both communities supported projects, anti-colonial projects in Ethiopia and India, but they drew on their identities as British subjects to do so. And I also explored tradition of protest based on secondary works on how African and Indian people came together on the plantation and in the city, looking at the rebellions of 1905 and 1924. Chapter 3, don't worry, I'll be finished in a minute. And if you look at this image here too, this is an image after the floods of 1934, and you can see that people are actually in sugar ponds as well. And it's really hard to move around the colony at this period of time. And this one, it plays on the language of the article that I mentioned, Up to Our Eyes in Water and Mud, Plantation Life and the Power of Neighborliness. And so I use an intersectional analysis to reconstruct the harshness of laborers' lives, specifically in the hydraulic environment in Guyana. And I want readers to think about what it meant to be alive and work on plantations in that colony and in that period. And I specifically ended up looking at the floods of 1934, and that kind of has taken over that whole chapter. But I discussed how these floods exposed the failures of British modernity and the weakness of colonial water infrastructure, but it also unleashed a crisis-based solidarity that demonstrated the power of neighborliness. And then chapter 4, which is one of the main chapters, which I'll discuss in a little bit, and this is heavily on the rebellions. And it uses a counterinsurgent archive to tease out an insurgent narrative of the uprisings. I look at the demands of working people and how the labor unrest spreads across the colony. And despite racialized job segmentation, residential segregation, and disparate historical experiences, the protests demonstrated active cooperation among these communities that confronted both the colonial state and the sugar economy. And these young people were very well represented in these uprisings. And in fact, it starts with that, with 80 young men from the boy gang on Plantation Leonora. And this chapter demonstrates that laborers were not only aware of their position in the colonial economy, but also advanced a vision of modern politics that connected their interests to the global interests of their day. Chapter 5 is about, it's called, I Thought the People Had Gone Crazy, Circuits of Imperial Society, and it shows how colonial officials and estate staff understood and responded to these events and developments, and how the colonial government operated as an extension of the sugar state. Because of the entrenchment of racial stereotypes, however, the cross-racial cooperations that were fundamental to the rebellions seemed implausible to colonial officials and was therefore rendered invisible. There's constant mention of outside agitators and Black people, and they say Black, right, who are rowdy and troublemakers, forcing Indians not to work. And you'll see that is not what the evidence shows. And the evidence shows that both groups were clearly leading and very much involved. And it wasn't just sugar workers, it was their families and communities. Finally, this chapter demonstrates the racial and ideological anxieties of colonialism and the wider fractures occurring within the British Empire during this period, including the activist response from officials in British India. And then finally, we have the rebellion aftermath. Explores some of the uneven impacts and highlights the aspiration of Guyanese workers in the wake of the rebellions. And as we know, these rebellions across the region actually spurred major changes in economic and social British imperial policy. And then I end with a conclusion, and then I have a postscript, which kind of tries to bring it up to the present, thinking about the politics of sugar and oil, explores the implication of this research for Guyana's current reality as a petrostate. And this transition also leads to the demise of the sugar industry, and thousands of workers were laid off. However, they are trying to rebuild the industry now. I'm not clear on how that's going, to be honest, but as Guyana moves from the margins of global circuits of capital, current racial tensions in the country have limited the possibility of a robust movement to either one, ensure that oil money benefits the entire country rather than serving to the advantage of a coveted few inside and multinational corporations, or two, to take the path less traveled, a more powerful and sustainable route that will benefit everyone globally. And the stakes are really high, and there's several people on the call who can speak to that, that I saw. So at this point, I just want to take you into a deeper dive on chapter 4, so you can have a stronger sense of some of the sources and some of the things I discuss. So as I mentioned, the 80 young men started the rebellion on Plantation Leonora, and their actions marked the beginning of the uprisings that moved from the West Coast to the East Coast, to the East Bank of Demerara, and on to the Berbice region. Many grassroots leaders emerged in this struggle for dignity, better wages, improved working conditions, the removal of abusive plantation staff, and an end to corrupt practices. They agitated for representation and voice in a system that provided little recourse for justice. Rather than merely grievances under the colonial structure, racialized hierarchy, and sugar industry-led governance of the time, their demands instead represented a vision that we can build on and think about today. And just so you have a sense of the racial demographics, and in the first chapter, I also you'll see there's a star next to the Amerindian population. And these are the people who were actually counted, but they said they weren't going to count Amerindians because they were not part of the productive element of the colony. And so I kind of talk about the politics of the census and who gets counted and how the hinterland gets completely disconnected from the coast in terms of how people think about what's productive and what's not productive. It's also important to understand that people are communities are positioned really differently who are working on sugar plantations. You have the residents who live in rent-free or reduced cost estate housing, which is notoriously horrible. They have access to free, and I put that in quotes on purpose, to estate hospitals. They tended to be the lowest paid on the estates. They were majority East Indian, and they also would be evicted when they participate in strikes and protests. They had much less autonomy. Then you have the village laborers who are mainly African, who lived in independent estates and independent settlements near the estates. They tended to build their own homes and relied on the sugar industry for employment, working as seasonal cane cutters during harvest time. And these, again, were majority African. And these differences really impact what people are asking for and also how they see each other, right? And then you have the pasture laborers, which is the smallest group. And they rented land, erected their own housing on the state grounds, and they were generally Eastern Europe. So back to thinking about chapter 4. And when I talk about histories of South Africa, I'm not talking about like easy or sugary or superficial stories that flatten people's lived experiences. I'm thinking about something deeper and much more profound and harder to sustain, right? And I'm thinking about seeds, right? Which kind of speaks to the nascent form of these politics, a politics that was in the making, that had a lot of possibility at the time. And sometimes when I say solidarity, people assume it means absence of conflict, and it obviously cannot mean that, right? Anyone engaged in social movements or anyone who studied them knows that conflict is built into the project of advancing justice. And another common assumption is that it papers over differences, that everybody forgets some of the ways in which they're targeted differently or experience these systems differently. And I argue that these communities actually included acknowledgement of differences through their practice, right? And how they advance labor struggle. And so I think of solidarity as political aspirations, relations built through struggles, and flowers of the imagination. It's about the vulnerabilities that connect people, and also about the connections that are developed through the use of collective power. And you see a couple of quotes there from two of the workers, and I'll give you a second to read that. So the two examples I want to give, let me see here, because I might skip one of them. The first example is among labor leaders, the partnership between Hubert Critchlow, who was a founder of the British Guiana Labor Union, which was founded in 1919. He was an early leader who developed regional ties around across the Caribbean and built international connections. He was an African Guyanese who was originally a stevedore by trade, and he worked in many industries before registering the BGLU with the government. He had traveled to Soviet Russia in 1932 to meet with the Congress of International Labor Defense. He also met with Black labor organizations in Germany, and he had ties to the Pan-Africanist and Communist Party member George Padmore, whose books and pamphlets were banned in British Guiana and in the world, actually, under the British Empire. In one speech, he argued, quote, "The class war is here in our midst," unquote. His understanding of class was also connected to his concerns about race and sovereignty. In the same speech, he referenced the struggle in India. Quote, "The condition of affairs in India today arises solely from the fact that the governing classes imagine that they have the right to hold down 300 million people whose skin is another color from their own, but whose ancient civilization is many centuries older than theirs." Critchlow functioned as a bridge among racialized communities, and he invited Chandra Bahadur Mathura, an East Indian labor leader from Trinidad, who was president of the clerk section of the Trinidad Labor Association, to travel around British Guiana with him and gain support for the union. During Mathura's visit to the colony in 1934, the BGLU threw him a welcome ceremony, and a report of his visit noted, quote, Mr. Mathura appealed to the East Indians in this colony to associate with the British Guiana Labor Union because of the fact that East Indians were more in number than the rest of the community in Trinidad and British Guiana. They must not forget that West Indians and East Indians were sons and daughters of slaves and immigrants, and it was their forefathers under a most vicious form of immigration who had made the colony the paradise that it was. Mr. Mathura emphasized the need for unity in spirit and thought, and he appealed to the people to drop their petty prejudices and to give their leaders unstinted support for the bettering of the condition of the masses. During another visit the following year, Mathura and Critchlow formed a team touring the country and speaking to workers. I have testimonies from some of the people sent to spy on these big speaking events by plantation management. And the people in the crowds actually warned him, hey, you need to be careful, there are police officers present. Mathura responded, I'm not afraid of them. They're always present in Trinidad as well, unquote. For Critchlow, what was memorable about Mathura's visit was his advice. He said, quote, the thing that Mathura preached was that the people must organize, that everything would be done to prevent them from organizing, and that their conditions were worse than in Trinidad, unquote. Mathura's presence and commentary in British Guiana speaks to the relationship among labor organizers in the British Caribbean, as well as efforts to bring Black and Indian working people together locally. And I'll give you another example from the rebellion itself. And I'll read this section it's a section from the book. It says, the sign was red with Black letters reading, quote, war declared, unquote. Just a few days before it appeared in October 1935, a crowd of 200 to 300 Indian and African plantation laborers and their communities marched through the Oval Estate in the colony of British Guiana, beating drums, carrying red flags, cutlasses, and sticks. Now, workers in the 200+ acre sugar acre tied the sign to long stalks of sugarcane as they voiced their distress over low pay, abusive staff, terrible working conditions, joining a wave of uprisings in the colony against the plantocracy. Deputy Plantation Manager Mr. Ross reported being forcibly removed from his mule and coerced into walking at the head of the march while holding a red flag. When asked about the I'm sorry, give me a second again. When asked about the composition of the protesters, Plantation Manager James Sutherland replied, quote, they were all mixed up, East Indians and Blacks, some resident on the estate and some non-residents, unquote. It turned out that the sign reflected the mood of the moment. Indeed, quote, a war had been declared, unquote. And he talks about how, quote, a gang of East Indians and Blacks, there's constant references to race in all these testimonies because there was a commission that was sent to investigate what happened. And so you have commentary across it, kind of identifying all the people who were involved. And even when they say, oh, it was this group, when you look through the rest of their testimony, it's clear that both groups are involved. Even based on the names, you can have a sense of that. And he continues to discuss how he tried to call the police and they came out, and then he had people guarding the plantation because a lot of times people were setting premature fires. And so he had people guarding, but he still thought things would move forward as normal. And a lot of the plantation staff kept saying, oh, I heard about it at this estate, but I said, it's not gonna happen with my workers. They're happy, they're content, right? And everybody's saying the same thing. Anyway, with this particular plantation manager, Sutherland, He described that some had sticks, some had red flags, some had cutlasses, and they were all talking and shouting amongst themselves, unquote. He returned to the factory, he called the police again. They sent out officers and a sergeant major. But the workers later cut the phone lines, and they did this on multiple estates. And he said the crowd was very agitated, quote, they started beating drums and shouting, and I looked out of the office and saw them making a rush for the factory. I went and tried to speak to them, but they were wild and would not listen to anybody, unquote. But others saw the events quite differently. One general laborer from Buxton Village, who had worked on several plantations and later faced prosecution for his role in the strikes, John Joseph Emmanuel Moses, declared that he had grievances regarding, quote, the oppression of the estate, unquote. And he later argued that, quote, we were not disorderly, but seeking for our rights, unquote. In conclusion, British Guyana's popular and labor upright organizing tradition during this period represents a radical different set of possibilities from the narrower racialist visions that were ultimately realized. Anthropologist and cultural theorist David Scott has rightly questioned the narrative of nation and modernity that drove the understandings of the 1930s Anglophone Caribbean. 1930s rebellions, universal suffrage, independence, so the narrative goes. However, in this case, the independence moment in British Guyana in 1966 actually represents a betrayal of the openings that were created in the 1920s and 30s rather than their culmination. In other words, it's important to look at this period on their own terms beyond the shadow of the 1960s. These particular rebellions represent an untidy and complicated, sometimes contradictory time of historical possibility when seeds of solidarity were planted through the actions of ordinary people. And I wanted to close with this statement from an activist from Red Thread in September 2020. The multiracial organization Women's Organization Red Thread held an international speak out about the violence plaguing Guyana in the wake of what seemed to be racial murders of 3 young men. And there were many speakers representing the racial diversity of Guyana, but I wanted to highlight the voice of Lena Free or Shalina Nagar. This is the last quote and I'm finishing. I think I'm out of time actually. But she said, I'm a 43-year-old queer Guyanese woman of Indian heritage, and I'm deeply, deeply hurt by the state we are currently in Guyana today as we mourn the loss of Joel and Isaiah Henry and Harash Singh. We say their names, but you know, they were not the first and not the young, they were not the first young and not so young lives to be taken in Guyana. I opened the paper today and I read about a young woman being killed by her partner. Guyana is and has been in a place of deep trauma for many years. This is not anything new, but we need to understand our history. We need to understand why things are the way they are. And so it's not just a race issue, it's how we treat anybody who's different or other. We need to embrace difference and realize that this is a powerful thing. It's something that can bring us together, you know, because there are forces, there are things that we as a nation have that people want. And if we're divided, it's easy for people to take advantage of us. And so I wish every day that more Guyanese would realize how much we have in common. People who are different from us are not the enemy. There are common threats to our existence that we need to unite and fight against. Otherwise, they're going to win and we're going to lose. And we are talking about things that affect our very existence, end quote. And I will stop there. Thank you for your patience and for listening.
Thank you very much, Nicole. That was wonderful. And I'm really, really, really excited about this book and looking forward to seeing it out. So I'm going to ask the first question, I guess. But in the meantime, if you have a question, you can either put it into the chat or just raise your hand and then unmute as you prefer. I really like that you ended and indeed began with kind of tracing this long history of inter-ethnic, cross-ethnic solidarity and taking it right up to the example from the present day. I also thought it was really interesting that you said that here you have in this labor rebellion in the 30s, this example of cross-racial organization at exactly the same time that you have this upsurge of sort of ethnic or racial consciousness on the part of both groups. And I was wondering, I also really liked the quotations you had from the workers that were up on one of the slides, one of them saying, you know, we're not slaves and so forth. So I was wondering what kind of language of solidarity did the workers, the strikers, the protesters use with regards to their struggle? A language of common class position, a language of neighborliness that you spoke of, their common identity as workers, as subjects of empire, or also still using, West Indian, East Indian. What kind of language of solidarity did they themselves put forward?
Yeah, there's a lot of the language of West Indian and East Indian, and also the commonality as workers. And in one of the strikes, they, and the thing is, with using colonial archive, you have to think about whether or not like whether what people are saying is true. What plantation staff is saying, they're afraid of Bolshevism, right? And they're saying that the people were yelling capital and labor and things like that, right? I've never been to a strike where people yell that, but anyway, it's clear that people see connections based on their labor position. And I think too that in terms of some of the union leaders, right, I think that they're talking about cross-racial solidarity, but I think the people are actually enacting it. And the thing is that they're not actually in control of what happens, right? Because they actually try to tell people not to strike, right? Even though they had encouraged them to strike before that. But and so in this particular rebellion, it's you have a large level of grassroots leadership. And in fact, the representations that meet with the different plantation owners, they're not including people from the union. The union is not allowed to be on the plantations. And so I feel like a lot of the leadership in Guyana is way more grassroots, and the people speak for themselves in ways that other people are speaking for them in other parts of the Caribbean. And so it's more about the practice. That's why I say seeds, right? Because people are clearly working together. And I also think the youth and elders relationship is interesting, because in one of the strikes, one of the plantation owners, he tries to talk to these young men who are sitting on the ground, and they don't answer him. They just start walking around, talking to elders, asking them to participate, and many of them end up joining. And so it's more about what people are actually doing, and some of the things that they say in terms of war declared, we're fighting for our rights, we're fighting against oppression. They're treating us like slaves, we're not, or they used to pay, it used to be paid more, now we're not getting paid enough to live, like those kinds of things. But you also see some of the tensions, right? Because you have some workers saying, well, you know what, they receive free housing, right? And so they don't have the same challenges that we have. And then you also see people who are like, I don't want to talk, because if I talk, I'm going to get evicted, right, from my housing. And so there's those kinds of tensions that emerge as well. And then you see people also advocating for women who are pregnant and grannies and things like that. So I don't know if I answered your question. I probably went off tangent, but
No, that was wonderful. I mean, I guess I see a queue of questions, but it's just a follow up on what you said, which is on the sources. So where were you able to find grassroots voices? And I was very curious as to, has there ever been any oral histories recorded or done from this period?
No,
Or
and that's one of the, they have the oral histories for the Jamaica Rebellion, and I'm very jealous of that. I did try to interview some elders, but it was really helpful. For example, one of them talked to me about the flood, and she kept talking about boats, and I was like, what is she talking about? And then I ended up finding all these people in boats during the floods, right? But a lot of times people had these are really, really, they were mentioning things from the 40s or the 50s, but it helped give me a sense of some of the time. So no, there's no oral histories that I know of that I've ever seen, and I wish there were actually.
Well, there's a number of hands up, so I'm going to take Joseph Antoine, please. You can unmute and speak.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm calling from Grenada.
Hi.
From Grenada. Thank you, Dr. Nicole. I'm
Thank
very
you.
impressed. And I want to ask you, first of all, before I ask you the question, do you know Dr. Marsha Hines Myrie?
Mm-mm.
So you sound very much like her. She does the same kind of analysis. And I would really
Really?
like to put you in touch with her. She's from Barbados, but is at Guelph. She has a department, I think, on gender in Guelph, University of Guelph.
I would love that. Please tell me your name
Yeah,
one more time.
Joseph Antoine.
No, oh, no,
Joseph Antoine.
yeah, please, definitely. I'll send you my email in the
Okay.
chat.
Yes, I want to ask you in terms of based on your studies, do you think that the kind of collaboration, the kind of interaction between the two main groups, the Africans and the East Indians, or for want of a better way to describe,
Right.
that was the basis for the kind of connection that was able to be forged through the works of the people of the WPA, especially Walter Rodney and U.C. Guiana and others. And also the work of Andy I, which Marcia quotes a lot when she talks. Do you think that there would have been a foundation for the kind of cooperation that was held between the group when at a time when there was so divide after the ousting of the government, the unity government between Forbes, Bonham, and Dr. Chedi Jagan. Are you think that ability to come together again? Because I saw some of that in Trinidad where East Indian people were defending the Dr. Walter Rodney when it was not kind of customary to see that even outside of Guyana.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm being clear enough.
Oh, sorry.
I hope I'm clear enough because
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
so
yeah,
good
you're
at
very
English.
clear. I definitely think this is a foundational moment. That's kind of why I focus on it. And I know Walter Rodney studied some of these periods. He was going to do another volume, and there's a piece where he's looking at the 1920s and the 1966 New World Group publication. And so, yes, I definitely think this is a foundational moment. I do think there's moments after 1966 where people do come together, and it's under the WPA in the 70s. I also think the women's organizing in the 1980s. So I think there's multiple moments in Guyanese history for this kind of collaboration and connection. I think with any movements, it's hard to sustain, right? And it has to be constant effort. I think people are still trying to do that now in the present, but I think the structures are really position people against each other in such big ways, right? And people do have very different experiences under different regimes. And so I think those are some of the things that we can look back to how people actually did overcome these. I mean, look at for me, like, here's a moment of the Great Depression. You also have the re-entrenchment of sugar in governance, right? And then you also have these environmental challenges, and people still made it happen, right? They still made it happen. They didn't fully win. They did win some things, but if they could do it in that time, certainly it's possible moving forward. So yeah,
You could,
yeah,
if I
definitely.
I know I cannot take the whole afternoon, but if I should ask you one further question, you said in terms of the guy who came to Guyana during 1934, 35, said that the workers in Guyana was a little much more in a worse situation than in Trinidad. But I studied in Trinidad for a while, and I learned that one of the challenges of the races in Trinidad, if I should use the word, I have difficulty using English language, in that sense, categorizing people.
Yeah.
But what the British did or the English did was to physically separate the races so that you have a concentration of East Indian in the central and southern part of Trinidad, whereas you had the African in the north and the east of Trinidad. So there was great distance, unlike in the United States where there were separation by rules, by laws. the physical space affected the collaboration of the folks in Trinidad. Was that the same in Guyana?
I would argue, I think more work needs to be done about the villages in Guyana, right? Because everybody I've spoken to, they always talk about how these villages become single race, but that they weren't before that time. And so I think there's way more mixing than we know. And I also think, sometimes, just like when Africans left the plantations and created villages, Indians also did the same thing, but they also joined other villages, right? They joined the villages that were existing already, which were mainly African villages, right? And so I think there was a lot of mixing, even though there's this huge division in terms of the plantation life, right? So you have this majority population on the plantations, tied to the plantations as a result of this history of indenture. And then you have these villages that tend to be majority African, but there's also mixing in those villages and also Indian villages being created as well. And so I do think there's more than we know, right? And then I was going to say something else, but I lost my train of thought. But thank you for your questions.
Gad, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Nicole, thanks very much. That was really interesting. You showed a slide. One of your slides was about different categories of workers, predominantly East Indian and residents, and then other ones. Now, these look like, the way you presented them, as potentially significant divisions among those groups.
Yeah.
Whether it's a class difference or a working difference. And of course, in your discussion, you're talking therefore about them overcoming those differences and cooperating. So it's kind of interesting I wonder if you can expand on the nature of those differences and perhaps in how they overcame, if you think those differences were very significant.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things was when they would meet with these different plantation owners, and they even tried to meet with the governor at different points, they would have representation from the different work groups. And some of them were mixed, right? And that it would say like East Indian gang, East Indian boy gang, or sometimes it's Creole gang, or these different workers were represented. So people, like there'd be like 10 people speaking, representing different classes of workers. And so that's what I mean by people incorporated some of the differences, and given the struggles that they had, there were only a few testimonies from estate workers, not from Indians, mind you, but from estate workers. So people who were tied to the estates, they had more trouble getting them to testify than they did with other populations but some people did because they had already been kicked off. Right, they had already been removed for participating in the strikes. They lost their homes, and so there's a discussion of those kinds of things as well. So yeah, I think there's important differences because, right, you have people who are living in villages who have to pay for their own water defense, who have to pay to go to the hospital if they need to go, who have who are struggling in terms of making a living because they're secondary workers on the plantations. Then you have this emergency kind of base of workers on the plantation who are called out whenever they're needed, right? Who are supposed to respond whenever they're needed, even if they're sick, even if they're struggling, they're supposed to respond, right? So even though people say it's post-indenture, even the plantation owners are saying, this is a throwback from indenture. This is how we think about it. And they're talking specifically in the indenture language, even though indenture is over, right? And so, yes, I think these different, and also, so yes, I think these differences are significant, but I think the way they deal with it is to have different representations of different classes of people, different classes in terms of the different work groups and their own experiences. And so they kind of talk about that. And I think that's kind of how they kind of deal with it. But I also am not saying that people just were like, oh, we're all the same, because I don't think that's true, right? And that's why I kind of look at overlapping diasporas, because people are clearly making racial claims, right, throughout the colony, and making connections that they see globally, right? So I feel like that's important too, at the same time as we have these divisions. But people also are are coming together in really interesting ways, and speaking about some of the international things as well. So
taking advantage of my position, building on what Kate said about, and I don't know if maybe you've already answered this one, but I heard you say something. This is the nature of the archive that you used, and I thought you said a counterinsurgent archive or something like that. And I thought, now, I of course one that's reading against the grain or other things, or is that what you meant, or are there something beyond that? Because it's interesting.
They're collecting information to see who is responsible. And so that's part of the reason why they're also trying to understand what happened so that they can prevent it from happening again. But part of what they're trying to figure out is who's responsible for this. And so that's why they keep saying, which nationality was it? Right? Which nationality was doing this? Was it Black or, like they ask very direct questions about race. So that's why I say it's a counterinsurgent archive. The other thing is, if you're caught doing things against the law or testifying about things that were against the martial law that was imposed, you can also go to prison for it, right? So people are being very like, oh, I wasn't involved. Oh no, I don't know. We struck, but we didn't do that. Or no, I was not involved in the strikes, but everybody else is saying that I was involved. Like so, and then and two people say they don't speak English, even though they were speaking English before. And so people are trying to avoid things, right? And avoid saying certain things when they testify. Some people are forced to testify, right? And so that's why I say it's a counterinsurgent archive.
What is the kind of evidence? Well, I mean, I don't want to go on, but what is the kind of evidence that when people had to testify before a commission or before
commission.
It was a commission of investigation?
It was a commission. It was an investigative commission that was created by the colonial government, and then you had people in the colonial office saying, you all have too many sugar representatives in government, and then this has no representation by Indian people. There were all kinds of the big labor unions boycotted the commission, and also so they were appointed by the governor. And so people were testifying. They were moving around the country, gathering testimony so that they could write this report about what caused all the problems, and what happened.
Great.
So
that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you. There's an M. Janke with your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Melinda, and I'm not going to put my camera on because my internet connection is dreadful. Nicole, I just wanted to say thank you. That was great. I learned a huge amount about a subject that I should have known much more about. And I'm really excited to know when your book is going to be coming out. And then I've got a couple of things that I just will run through quickly. One is, the slides were excellent, and you had a photo of 3 Indian women. I wondered if you knew who they are and where you might have gotten the slide from.
Okay, yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'll wait till you finish.
Okay. The other is you mentioned, I think, sort of bringing the story a bit up to date. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts about including, and maybe you've already done this, the US CIA instigation of race hatred in the 1960s, because the 1960s, it was the worst. And that was very much something instigated by the United States. It wasn't an indigenous Guyanese thing. And that has since been used by, I'm going to probably annoy a lot of people right now, but anyway, I'll say it, that it's been used by politicians to divide people in Guyana. This is not a natural part of our society. This is not who we are. It's a political thing. And in a way, I think you could say, to some extent, race has been weaponized by politicians. I think the last thing I wanted to just ask also is this very interesting thing that you have of oil and sugar, both obviously exploitative, both obviously serving the interests of foreigners rather than the Guyanese. But I also wondered whether you were going to mention in any way the the fight back against the oil and the culture of illegality. And I'm only saying this because I have particular interest in this, because I've brought 7 cases against the oil production based on the rule of law. I mean, people try and miniaturize this as environmental cases, but this is actually fundamental to Guyana and to who we are. And these are cases that are brought to uphold the rule of law. And while I'm on, I just want to pay tribute to the women, including Lena, who have been litigants in those cases. So that's it. Thank you very much, Nicole.
Thank you very much. And we don't know each other, but I know who you are. And I'm so excited that you're here. And your work has been so important in terms of challenging Exxon and the ways they constantly just ignore some of the laws and the environmental protections that Guyana already had in place. And so Melinda Janke, for those of you who don't know, continues to play a huge role. She also wrote the EPA in Guyana. And I think if you want to talk about that a little bit more, I think that is so important. It's scary because there's so many lawsuits against them in the United States as well, and they just continue to do engage in the behavior that they engage in, right? And so I think there has to be an international movement against some of the things that they're doing all over the world, but in Guyana in particular, it has such devastating effects, and there is a grassroots movement. There's also a legal movement, and I know people are talking about it in the press and also trying to get other Caribbean countries to talk about it in the press as well. And now we also are thinking about all the stuff with Venezuela, but I think you're right that it's not natural, that it is created. I mentioned, I don't go through all that history in the book, but I do mention 1960s and talk about some of the different interpretations and also the British-American collusion around creating divisions in order to prevent Guyana from going into the communist domain as part of Cold War politics. And also some of the ways politicians use those divisions, artificial divisions. And I have in terms of the question of the colonial archive before that guy was talking about, I think that's hard for me too in terms of doing the research, because I take on these categories when there's so much more going on than these categories, right? And so I think that's one of the challenges of using colonial archive. It's easy to reproduce some of the categories that are so entrenched, right, that get created under colonial regimes. In terms of the photos, it's from the Jean Bahadur Singh collection, and that's in Guyana itself. He has a beautiful photo collection. I don't know if it's cataloged or not, but I think that's one of the images from there. And I had gotten a lot of images from there, but I don't have information about who the people are all the time at all, and most of the time, 9 times out of 10. And so it's something that I'm really interested in finding out the names of the people in some of that collection.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I can tell you the one in the middle is my grandmother.
What? Are you joking?
No,
Please
I can find out the names of the other 2 for you as well.
Yes, I would love that. Can you send me your email?
I will absolutely do that. Yes, thank you again for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
This is great. There's another grandmother connection in the comments, which you don't have to respond to, but from Ra Hendricks, who's saying that his mother was 9 in 1935 and has he has those memories of speaking about her experience as being a PPP supporter and so forth. So there's another great example of grandmothers and their memories. There's a question.
Hendricks, I think you're also on point with this as well. It's absolutely correct. And thank you for sharing your story.
There's a question from Luke. Hi, Luke.
Hey, good evening. Thanks for the presentation. It's a great presentation, Dr. Nicole. I just had a question, like, I guess the legacies of this and where you see the state of race relations now in Guyana. Like at the moment with the whole Venezuela situation, there's all this like pushing of this whole one Guyana ideology by the government and things like that. I was actually in Guyana for MASH early this year, for MASH Romani early this year. And kind of saw it. So again, this whole like kind of pushing of the one Guyana, one people, one nation, one destiny ideology. And yeah, I guess I know that I am a somewhat optimistic, like Guyanese immigrant, like both my parents are from Guyana. Like I have this kind of perfect view of Guyana and like yeah, somewhat optimistic view of Ghana of how it is right now. But just I wanted to ask what you kind of saw as the current state of race relations in Ghana. And I guess I wanted to add as well another kind of grandmother thing to add. My grandma is actually mixed Indian and African descent. So I've got somewhat a bit of a connection there as well. But yeah, just wanted to ask how you saw kind of the
Yeah.
relation now.
I think there's a lot of work going on around social cohesion, is what a lot of people call it. And I think it's really, really important work. I think that's different from the government's kind of one Guyana type of discussion. I think the things that happen on a daily basis, the ways that people support each other, the kind of organizing that happens, the art, right? There's so much art that where people are talking about a different kinds of politics. And in one song, there's a song that they played at that Speak Out where one of the artists, I think Romeo Mystic, he talks about don't let the politicians come and divide us, right? and I think that still holds true today. I do have a lot more hope, especially with younger people. Sometimes though, it is really tough because like I've been in conversations where people are talking about indenture and enslavement. You know, they had the Gladstone visit in the summer, and that also unleashed a lot of controversy. And so sometimes when I hear those kinds of conversations or see the differences in how people are thinking about even Exxon or things like that, or the government and those things, those conversations sometimes, especially, and sometimes I wonder too if it's more of a diaspora conversation or, yeah, there's a lot of conversations that sometimes are disheartening to be part of, as well as the ones that are really powerful and heartening. And so sometimes, yeah, I think if people are really committed to a different kinds of politics, I think those folks who are leading those kinds of struggles are the ones that I am very excited about. So I think it's mixed, Luke. And one of the things that I was really moved by, like I read a lot of Douglas poetics, right? And I know there's lots of critiques of it, but I find it so inspiring, right? And it's about thinking about these overlapping histories of indenture and enslavement and how it produced new cultures. And so those kinds of work are it's really inspiring to me, even if, you know, people have critiques about that kind of stuff as well. So yeah, hopefully I answered you. What do you think, since you were just there for Mashramani?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's like as I said, I know I have like somewhat optimistic views. Like I have like I'm born and raised in London, but I have this idea of why I'm gonna kind of retire in Ghana and all this stuff, and you know, like kind of the standard thing of a lot of members of the diaspora. But it's interesting kind of going there. I've been there quite a few times the past few years, speaking to people, and obviously like mostly trying to gauge like opinions of like people of my age group, like kind of early 20s, like youngish people, like my cousins and stuff. And it really varies person to person. You know, sometimes in like I guess in more somewhat like colloquial speak when we're speaking in like general and there isn't any fear of people hearing things or stuff like that. There's a lot of like kind of underhand comments and stuff that may be somewhat problematic, but it seems like there is an overarching goal for this whole one guy and the thing that's being pushed, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. There's a question from Wei Bing.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And my question is a little bit similar to Luke's, but I mean like situated in the solidarity movement you investigate. Do you think this solidarity movement make the during the solidarity movement, do you think the racial the division between like Hindu and Afro Afro workers are underplayed, and the racial designation are underplayed a bit in the solidarity movement, or they still firmly affirm that I am Indian worker, I am African worker, so they still firmly affirm their ethnic identity. And the second part is that like I'm interested in the difference different interests in the solidarity movement? Do you think like there is like collision between the different interests of Afro workers and Indian workers during this solidarity movement? Is there like a like conflict based on they come from different ethnic group, and is their ethnic identity underplayed or still affirmed? If I make sense.
Yes, you make sense. I guess that's one of my main arguments, that it's not that people are like, oh, I don't have an identity or ethnic identity. I think they are very clearly connecting to their ethnic and racial identities. And I use race to kind of also signal some of so we know that the relationships are porous and people's identity are porous, right? But the way that it's talked about at that time is very much racialized. So it's these people and these people, right? So yeah, I think that folks are coming together, but I don't think that means that they're like, oh yeah, my racial identity doesn't matter or my ethnic identity doesn't matter. So that's one of the main arguments of the book. And then your second, can you repeat your second question?
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm just saying that like is there like because you talk about like how the interest, their appeal can be different based on the social class, different kind of worker, but is there like their interest can be different based on their different ethnic group?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. That's a good question, because I really talk more about positionality and positionality based on which are based on historical racialized difference, right? So part of the reason you have people on the plantation is a result of the indenture period, which is continuing. Some of the structures continue into the 1930s, even though indenture is over. You also have the Indian government, which is like advocating on behalf of people of Indian descent, and saying that the things that they're proposing to create in response to the rebellions are not, they don't have teeth, which he's right, which they're right. It's several people who are saying this, and it's also in Indian news. And so you have this back and forth with the Indian government as well, or it's a colonial government at the time, but there's Indian officials in the government who are sending emissaries to meet with these different communities and things like that. And so I think, sometimes there's questions of religion that come up, and I think those tend to be based in historical ethnic identities. Sometimes it's about, thank you. Sometimes it's about, what was I gonna say? I don't know, it just slipped my mind, but I think the majority of the ways I've looked at it has been about the differences in positionality, and also the ways that people are thinking about racial identity and diasporic through the kinds of diasporic connections that they have. So that's kind of how I kind of look at that and kind of make that argument. But there's work in the 19th century that argues that, so Walter Rodney's work has one position around this kind of question in the 19th century, but then you also have people like, oh my goodness, what is his name? So can someone help me? Moore is the last name, Brian Moore, who talks more about these histories of differences in culture and religion, and how that also plays a role in creating conflict and racial dynamics. So I don't know if I answered you, but hopefully I did.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. You're making me think though. I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to think about that a little bit more clearly.
Well, thank you. I think we've tested you long and hard after your wonderful talk. I want to thank everybody for their great questions and comments as well. If anyone is not on the mailing list for this seminar series and would like to be, I'll put in the chat emails that you can contact if you want to be added to the list for this series. Our next one in the series will be on the 24th of January, and that's going to be Celia Naylor talking on the fascinating subject of unsilencing slavery, telling truths about Rose Hall Plantation, Jamaica. So that will be on the 24th of January, and if you'd like to be on the list, I'll pop my email and my colleague Steve's email into the chat. So there's a question in the chat about whether the recording of the seminar will be available online. That's TBC, so not necessarily. That will be to be confirmed later. So I'd like to extend a very big thanks again to our speaker, Nicole Burrows, for a wonderful talk, and everyone will be waiting eagerly for your book to come out. And who knows, maybe we can have a big launch whenever it's out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you everyone for coming.